Grey's Anatomy is a long-running medical drama that first aired in 2005 and is still ongoing today. Over the years, the series has introduced countless characters, storylines, and emotional twists. As the seasons progressed, some original characters were written out, while new faces took center stage, sometimes leaving earlier stories or relationships overlooked or forgotten. In this retrospective, I'll be revisiting season 1 of Grey's Anatomy to explore how it all began. I want to see how the first season compares to the show's most recent episodes, both in tone and storytelling, and whether it still holds up to today's standards in television. I'll be breaking down key plot points, sharing my thoughts on major events and reflecting on how the show developed its core characters. I'll also be keeping track of the evolving relationships and character arcs, aiming to get a full picture of what season 1 had to offer and why it set the stage for such a successful series. Meredith wakes up from a one-night stand. She seems to regret it and wants nothing more to do with the man. She mentions she might be late for work and explains that she kind of lives in the house she's in. It belonged to her mother, and she recently moved from Boston. She also clarifies that her mother isn't dead. Meredith brushes Derek off and heads to work. At the hospital, she's introduced to the surgical floor along with the other interns by Chief Richard Weber, who warns them that only 2 of them are likely to survive in the surgical program. We're introduced to Christina and George, who note that they're being trained by Miranda Bailey, infamously known as the Nazi. Izzy is introduced next and gets brushed off when she tries to greet Bailey. Bailey then lays down her rules as their resident. The interns are quickly paged for a patient, and this is when Dr. Burke is introduced. Each intern is given a task. Meredith has to find the CT room, Izzy is assigned rectal exams, and Christina gets caught spying on a surgery. She delivers her patient's results to Bailey and asks if it's true that the attending on call gets to pick the best intern to assist in surgery. Bailey ignores her. Meanwhile, Meredith gets lost in the hospital, and George struggles to insert an IV. Dr. Burke steps in, clearly annoyed, and shows him how it's done. At lunch, Christina reveals that Meredith is royalty. Her mother is Ellis Gray, creator of the Gray Method and a 2-time Harper Avery winner. When Burke walks in, he confirms the rumor. He does get to pick an intern to assist. To everyone's surprise, he chooses George. Privately, Bailey tells Burke that George barely made it into the program and isn't cut out for surgery. Burke replies that he picked George to terrorize him, because making one suffer keeps the others in line. Later, Burke is taken off the case, and Meredith is shocked to see that Derek, her one-night stand, is now the attending on call. She tells him they can't be a thing and that they need to forget what happened. Derek disagrees and asks her out. She declines. The interns start betting on whether George will fail. He does, and Alex mockingly nicknames him 007, License to Kill. George vents about the nickname and admits he needs to find his own place. Izzy hesitates to wake Bailey for help, afraid to break the rules. When she finally does, Bailey warns her that next time, the patient had better be nearly dead with a toe tag on. Alex is formally introduced when he dismisses a nurse rudely. George tries to impress him but fails. Meanwhile, Meredith's patient crashes, and when she tries to intervene, both Bailey and Derek scold her. She later gets physically sick from the stress. George makes the mistake of promising that Burke's patient will sail through surgery. Meanwhile, Derek challenges the interns to diagnose a difficult patient and promises that whoever gets it right will scrub in. Alex doesn't seem to care as his own patient is dying. Christina asks Meredith to team up on the diagnosis, but Meredith refuses because of her connection to Derek. She eventually tells Christina about the one-night stand. While insulting the patient out of frustration, Meredith stumbles upon the real cause of the seizures. She and Christina report it, and Derek picks Meredith to assist in surgery. Christina is furious and storms off. Burke's patient dies in surgery, and George, who had made a promise to the patient's wife, now has to deliver the devastating news. Burke angrily insists that George be the one to tell her she's a widow. Christina and Meredith argue, and Christina takes a low blow by bringing up Meredith's mother. George tearfully informs the patient's wife that her husband didn't survive. Meredith later asks Derek if he chose her to assist because they slept together. Derek insists she earned it. She was on the case from the beginning and figured out the diagnosis. Meredith and George talk. She reveals that her mother never believed she'd make it as a surgeon. Alex gets scolded by Richard for his poor treatment of a patient. During a teaching moment, Richard asks for a diagnosis. Meredith gives the correct answer, and he instructs Alex to follow her plan, removing him from the case. Richard praises Meredith, saying she's just like her mother. Meredith and Derek's surgery is a success. Christina and Meredith reconcile, and Meredith compliments Derek. That night, all the interns return home together. It's revealed that Meredith has been narrating the day's events to her mother, who, due to Alzheimer's, doesn't remember her. Meredith decides to keep living in the house. Meredith is interviewing potential roommates. Izzy and George both want to move in with her, but they get pulled away by Bailey, who doesn't appreciate their ambition for surgery and assigns them tasks to keep them busy. In the elevator, Meredith and Derek share a tense moment. Meredith reiterates that they're not going to happen, but Derek still pushes, and they end up kissing. After a surgery, Burke tries to bond with Derek over drinks, but Derek turns him down. He mentions that Richard was the one who brought him to Seattle Grace. Christina and George are venting about their workload when Bailey informs Christina that Alex will be joining her team to shadow her. Christina immediately expresses her dislike for Alex, calling him a pig. Izzy meets a patient who doesn't speak English, which creates a communication barrier. Meredith is tasked with handling an unusual case. She's literally carrying around the severed penis of a rapist who is still at large. When she visits Patricia's room, Patricia asks to see it. Richard walks in and asks about Meredith's mother moving. Meredith lies, saying her mom is just taking some time off. She's then told she has legal custody of the penis and must continue carrying it. Christina and Alex are assigned to tell patients they're going to live, something neither of them finds fulfilling. Meredith is deeply unsettled by the rape case. As a woman, it hits close to home. George tries to cheer her up by taking her to look at newborns. While there, Meredith notices something off about one of the babies and checks on it, but another intern scolds her for interfering. Izzy, struggling with the language barrier, sarcastically asks Christina to help. But Christina snaps back that she's Korean and doesn't know Chinese. Burke confronts Richard about the chief of surgery position, insisting it should be his, not Derek's. Richard counters that Burke has become too comfortable and arrogant. While treating patients, one recognizes Izzy and calls her out as the model. She continues checking on the Chinese patient despite the challenges. Meredith tells Christina about kissing Derek. Christina dubs him McDreamy. The rapist eventually shows up at the hospital and undergoes surgery. Burke presses Richard again about why he's no longer the top pick for chief. Richard tells him it's because he's developed a god complex. Izzy sends the Chinese woman away, frustrated by the language barrier. Meanwhile, Christina and Alex continue arguing over patient care. Meredith goes back to check on the baby she was worried about. She speaks to the parents and recommends doing an echo to check the heart. Burke overhears and decides to back her up, ordering the test. Izzy sees the Chinese patient again outside the hospital and discovers her daughter has been badly injured but refuses to enter. Izzy secretly brings out medical supplies to treat her. The test confirms that Meredith was right about the baby's condition. Burke warns her not to bypass protocol again, or he'll make her time at the hospital miserable. Izzy treats the injured girl and promises not to report anything, but insists they return for a checkup in 5 days. Burke asks Bailey if she thinks he's arrogant. She bluntly says yes and tells him he has a god complex. Derek's patient isn't improving. Derek mentions he has 4 sisters, and shortly after, the patient codes. Later, Derek tries to accept Burke's earlier invitation for a drink, but Burke declines, bitter over both of them being promised the chief position. Meredith finally hands the severed penis over to the police, then scrubs in on a surgery with Burke's permission. Derek informs the rapist that the police now have his penis. At the end of the day, Meredith invites George and Izzy to move in with her. Derek's patient wakes up, and as he enters an elevator, he jokes about Meredith, hinting that he's still very much interested. The episode begins with Izzy and George fighting over who gets the bigger room. Meredith, clearly annoyed, tries to ignore them. George asks about her mother and when she's returning, but Meredith brushes off the question. At the hospital, Miranda, Bailey, and Derek are talking when Bailey realizes she's forgotten something. It turned out to be dead baby bike race day, a notoriously chaotic day in the ER. All the interns get assigned to the pit, except George. Bailey specifically excludes him, not wanting him caught in fights over patients. Naturally, the others immediately begin arguing. Izzy and Christina fight over a case, and so do Meredith and Alex. Izzy and Christina's patient turns out to be brain dead. Meanwhile, George is assigned a clinical patient who believes he's dying, and who openly flirts with George. Curious about what happens if the brain-dead patient fails his tests, Izzy asks Christina. Christina bluntly says, he's dead. Izzy doesn't believe her, but Derek confirms it. Christina admits she wants the surgery, which earns judgment from Izzy, who says it would be a waste of life. Christina agrees, but clarifies that it would be a waste of organs. Meredith gets her patient to sign an advance directive, AAE, and he surprises her by kissing her. Derek witnesses the moment and is visibly jealous. He again asks Meredith out, and she again turns him down. She accuses him of only wanting the chase and storms off, saying that is what he wants. Christina and Izzy ask Bailey about harvesting the John Doe's organs. Bailey calls them out, saying they just want the surgery and that the situation is complicated. The patient is a John Doe, so they need to find his family and get consent first. George is embarrassed by his flirty patient. Alex jokes that he should go for it. George angrily insists he's not gay, and Alex quickly apologizes. Later, George asks Christina if she thinks Meredith believes he's gay. Christina bluntly asks if he is. George says no. Christina seems surprised, and George storms off. Izzy and Christina are still looking for the John Doe's family, especially because he's a match for George's patient. Izzy, speaking to the unconscious John Doe, asks him to hang on a little longer. Right then, he starts crashing. Izzy wants to save him, even though they're supposed to let him go. Meredith tries to stop her, but Izzy convinces her to help keep him alive just a little longer. They turn to Burke, who scolds them for making a bad call. He refuses to help and tells them to leave him alone. Meredith then goes to Derek, and together they come up with a plan. They get George to speak to Richard and override Burke's refusal. Burke is ultimately forced to help stabilize the John Doe. Soon after, the patient is identified, and they find his family. Richard informs George's patient that a liver may now be available. Meanwhile, Alex brags about assisting Burke in surgery and acts like a jerk. Meredith yells at him, and Derek physically stops her from hitting him. Meredith returns home to find George and Izzy going through her mother's things. She yells at them in frustration. Christina is assigned the difficult task of asking the John Doe's wife for organ donation consent. The wife is cold and unfeeling. Bailey later reminds Christina that the John Doe has a name, he's someone's family, and that what they're doing isn't easy. Christina returns to the room and respectfully finishes the conversation. Back in the hospital, George's patient asks him out. George gently tells him he's not gay. The patient replies, I know. George asks why he asked, and the patient says dying makes you stop caring. He then asks George if there's someone he has feelings for. George answers, Meredith. Preparations begin for the organ harvest. Suddenly, Meredith's earlier patient returns in critical condition. He's rushed into emergency surgery. Bailey scolds Alex for not paying closer attention to the patient during his earlier visit. The organ harvest is successful. Izzy stays behind to sew up the John Doe, wanting to give his family some peace. All the surgeries go well. Derek tells Meredith it's not the chase, suggesting his feelings for her are real. Later, Meredith comes home to find George and Izzy going through her mother's tapes again, but this time, she's okay with it. Let's take a little break to talk about some of the characters a little more in depth. Izzy. Izzy is a supporting character so far. She doesn't have much in terms of an ongoing storyline this season. Instead, we get a few episodes that give us more insight into who she is as a person and as a doctor. Izzy is peppy and intrusive. She gets too involved with her patients and the lives of her friends. This is because she cares deeply and wants the best for everyone, but she often makes things more difficult for herself or the situation by making things too personal. George. George is the nice guy archetype. He's well-meaning and shy, but tends to trip up in conversations from getting nervous and flustered. This mirrors how he practices medicine. He seems to be the least confident doctor out of all the interns. However, he gradually improves in skill and confidence throughout the season. His ongoing storyline revolves around his feelings for Meredith, which he still hasn't been able to express. George is very much the runt of the intern group, a position he clearly doesn't enjoy. He wants to be respected more, but struggles to be heard and taken seriously. Christina Yang. Christina, unlike Izzy, doesn't care too much about her patients. She's there for the medicine and to improve through surgery, not for emotional connections. However, throughout the season, Christina has a few difficult patients and tough days that show the patients do affect her, even if she doesn't want to admit it. Her refusal to acknowledge her emotions becomes a recurring theme in future episodes, as her discomfort with vulnerability impacts not just her work at the hospital, but her personal life as well. George and Meredith are growing increasingly uncomfortable with Izzy invading their shared space. At the hospital, Bailey warns them that if Izzy makes her look bad, she'll make all of their lives miserable. Alex tries flirting with Izzy, but she shuts him down immediately. Christina mentions that people are gossiping about Meredith sleeping with an attending. Meredith tells Derek she doesn't want to be seen with him at work and asks him to keep things professional. Derek agrees. Christina is eager to impress Burke in hopes of being chosen for a surgery. Meanwhile, Izzy gets rejected by a patient who refuses to let her treat him because he recognizes her from her former modeling career. Meredith suspects that George has a crush on Izzy, but later finds out he actually likes someone else. George and Meredith are assigned a new patient. Richard tries to reassign Christina's patient to Meredith, but Burke steps in to defend Christina and ensures she stays on the case. Alex makes a comment about Izzy's modeling past, jokingly comparing George's crush on her to how he views his own sister. Despite Izzy trying to remain professional, her patient continues to reject her. Bailey intervenes and tries to help. Izzy confides in Bailey about her modeling background and asks for a new patient. Bailey refuses, telling her she has to learn to deal with it. Alex finds and prints out Izzy's old modeling photos, passing them around the hospital. Burke pressures Christina to prove herself worthy of the Whipple procedure. She notices that the surgery isn't on the board and grows frustrated. Meredith delivers a message from a patient's mother to Christina's patient, but the patient rejects it, saying it's not true. Meanwhile, Meredith spends time with her own mother, showing her old family photos. Back at home, Izzy and George argue after he refuses to buy tampons. Everyone laughs at Izzy, but she's visibly annoyed. Christina's patient asks who's taking care of her. Christina coldly replies, just a bed. Izzy discovers the printed photos Alex distributed and is humiliated. She insults him in front of others, calling him broke and pointing out that, unlike him, she's not in debt. She later lashes out at her patient for not wanting her involved in his care. Christina angrily confronts Burke about the Whipple not being scheduled, but later realizes her patient is terminal and was only brought in to die comfortably. Meredith opens up to her patient about her mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis. The patient responds by bluntly calling her mother a bitch. Bailey scolds Izzy for being too emotionally involved and too understanding with her patient. As Christina's patient declines, Christina desperately wants to save her, even though the patient has a DNR, do not resuscitate order. Despite her emotions, Christina ultimately respects the DNR and lets her go. Meredith pushes for surgery on a patient, even though doing so borders on illegal. She's determined to help. Izzy later apologizes to George for emasculating him earlier. She explains that she just wanted to preserve the patient's nerve endings and wasn't thinking about how it came across. Christina, visibly emotional, calls the time of death for her patient. Meanwhile, Izzy's patient is successfully saved. At the end of the episode, Meredith goes on a date with Derek. Meredith is dealing with legal issues regarding her mother's care. She needs her mom to sign over control of her estate and finances. The stress, paired with lack of sleep, catches up with Meredith, and she begins dozing off during surgery. Meanwhile, Izzy is planning a big party at Meredith's house. She explicitly doesn't invite Alex, who takes it personally. Meredith, distracted and exhausted, is unsure she performed correctly in surgery and begins to worry she made a mistake. George reassures her and tells her not to say anything to Burke. Alex is assigned a patient who is a drug addict. When told to administer pain medication, Alex grows visibly frustrated and hesitates to follow the order. Derek later reprimands him for withholding medication, causing Alex to storm off in anger. Burke brings Christina coffee, an early sign that he's developing romantic feelings for her. In a separate case, George's patient begins showing unusual symptoms. The team discovers that a surgical towel was left inside the patient during a previous operation. Bailey launches an investigation to find out who's responsible. She hears about Izzy's party and jokingly asks if she can attend, to which they nervously agree. Christina later discovers that Burke was the attending surgeon during the initial operation, where the towel was left behind. Derek tells Meredith he doesn't want to go to the party and would rather spend time alone with her elsewhere. However, before anything can happen, Meredith's patient suddenly crashes. Overwhelmed with guilt, Meredith confesses that she might have made a serious mistake during surgery, possibly medical malpractice. Burke is furious at her for the error. Later, it's revealed that Meredith actually didn't make a mistake after all. She's called into a meeting with Richard, likely over the incident. Derek tries to comfort her afterward, but Meredith brushes him off. When she attempts to apologize to her patient, the conversation goes poorly. Meanwhile, Alex's patient refuses to be discharged and numbs her own head with lidocaine to avoid leaving. This forces Alex to stay behind and assist in an emergency brain surgery. At home, Meredith is annoyed about the party, but instead of confronting it, she chooses to get drunk. Alex, beginning to open up, makes a vague comment about growing up in a home with addiction, suggesting a more personal reason for his frustration earlier. Izzy's boyfriend unexpectedly shows up at the hospital, clearly irritated by her workload and commitment. Alex tells Izzy to go home and enjoy her party. She does, but her boyfriend ends up breaking up with her. Heartbroken, Izzy returns to the hospital. Meanwhile, Meredith, still drunk, has a vulnerable moment with Derek. They kiss and end up having sex in his car, unaware that Bailey sees them. Later, Izzy apologizes to Meredith, who quietly accepts. Burke ultimately takes full responsibility for the surgical towel being left inside the patient, defending Meredith and clearing her name. Still, Meredith is suspended for the incident. Tension begins to rise between Christina and Burke, but it doesn't last long. They end up sleeping together. Back at home, the group works together to clean up the house after the party. Meredith doesn't want to get out of bed, overwhelmed by everything happening in her life. Izzy playfully teases George about his obvious feelings for Meredith, though George denies it. Meanwhile, Meredith is running late and dreading facing Bailey after her suspension. At the hospital, Derek questions whether Meredith wants him to be a better man. Their relationship is clearly weighing on both of them. Burke and Christina are still secretly sleeping together, but Christina warns Meredith that her relationship with Derek could get her blacklisted from surgery. Burke is pulled into one of Alex's cases, and Bailey announces that due to a shortage of surgeons, there'll be no one around to clean up after anyone's mistakes. Under pressure, Burke asks Christina to involve her mother in helping secure a crucial surgery. George continues to deny having feelings for Meredith, though his actions suggest otherwise. When Meredith and Derek arrive at work together, Bailey notices, and she's not happy. She confronts Derek, telling him he may be her boss, but he doesn't scare her. If he gives Meredith any more special treatment, she warns, Meredith will be pulled from surgeries for a month, without needing to say a word about why. In the OR, Alex makes a major mistake by accidentally insulting his patient over the intercom. The patient refuses to let him participate in her surgery, and Burke tears into Alex for his carelessness. George and Christina are selected to scrub in instead. While prepping, George admits to the patient that he has feelings for Meredith. Meredith wants to end things with Derek, frustrated by how he's been treating her. Meanwhile, George tries to ask Meredith out in front of their group, but completely fumbles the attempt. It's awkward, and everyone notices. Meredith's patient agrees to undergo brain surgery. Meredith later tries to explain to Bailey that she didn't know Derek was her attending when they first met. Bailey replies that it doesn't matter. What matters is how it's affecting her day. She's tired of discussing Meredith's sex life, and warns her that if her friends find out about the relationship, they'll turn their backs on her. When that happens, Bailey says, Meredith will come crying to her, and she won't want to hear it. Alex, meanwhile, leaves his pager in his locker and forgets to change the batteries. While he's off watching a surgery, Izzy is left to handle his responsibilities. One of her patients starts crashing, and Izzy has to perform an emergency procedure she's never done before. Under pressure, she succeeds. Later, Derek tells Meredith he was only trying to protect her. But she tells him she doesn't need his protection. She needs to figure things out on her own. Alex tries to ask Meredith out, but she immediately turns him down. He later yells at Izzy for not paging him during the emergency. She fires back at him, pointing out it's his own fault for being unreachable. Alex's patient ends up dying, leaving him shaken. Meredith's patient, on the other hand, is walking and recovering well after surgery. It's a success. At the end of the episode, Burke asks Christina what their relationship means. Christina coolly replies, you need a definition? You want to be that guy? Unwilling to label what they have. Finally, Alex tells George that Meredith is already seeing someone, hitting a nerve George was trying to suppress. Let's take another break to talk about some more characters. Bailey. Bailey is the intern's resident, and this season she doesn't have much in terms of a personal storyline. She's an amazing supporting character, though. With everyone in the hospital being a little delulu, she really grounds the show and gives the characters the reality check they desperately need. You can tell she likes the interns, but she is very much sick of their nonsense, and it shows every time they stress her out. Bailey is my favorite Grey's Anatomy character, and I'd love to learn more about her. I'm sure she'll be expanded upon in future seasons. Burke. Berkey is the head of cardiothoracic surgery and a respected doctor at the hospital. He takes his job very seriously and serves as a strong example for the intern group. He has a friendly rivalry with Derek, especially since he has ambitions to become chief of surgery. At the same time, he tries to show a romantic side, particularly through his relationship with Christina. The story doesn't really follow his perspective for now, so he doesn't have an ongoing storyline of his own. He's mostly just a big part of Christina's arc this season. That's not ideal. I'd like to see him have more going on outside of Christina. Derek is the head of neurosurgery and is almost the opposite of Burke. Where Burke is serious and composed, Derek is more relaxed and go with the flow. He's similar to Burke in that he doesn't have much going on outside of Meredith. He's mainly just meant to be McDreamy, if you will. This season, his entire focus is trying to win over Meredith and get along with her friends, the other interns. Like Burke, I'd like to see more development for Derek that doesn't revolve around Meredith. Meredith and Derek are still sneaking around, trying to keep their relationship under wraps. George and Izzy are suspicious and start wondering who the mystery man is. Eventually, they figure it out. It's Derek. Alex is beginning to mesh more with the intern group, and they're earning a bit more trust and camaraderie. Christina, on the other hand, suspects everyone knows about Meredith and Derek. Meredith hopes not, especially since Bailey is already treating her more harshly, likely because of the unspoken tension surrounding the affair. Izzy is in a bad mood, frustrated that she isn't getting the recognition she feels she deserves for her work. She's also angry at Meredith, accusing her of having an unfair advantage by sleeping with an attending. George jumps to Meredith's defense, pointing out that it's Derek who holds the power in the situation. Meanwhile, Christina is sick. It's flu season, but she refuses to go home despite Burke's insistence. She's determined not to miss any opportunities, even while unwell. As George prepares for a surgery, he notices something disturbing. The anesthesiologist seems to be drunk. Anxious and unsure what to do, he asks the group for advice, but no one offers anything helpful. He's stuck with the responsibility and growing unease. Elsewhere, Alex is bonding a little too much with a patient who got shot on purpose. While Alex sees it as rebellious or cool, everyone else realizes it's just reckless and sad. He even makes casual plans with the patient, still not grasping the seriousness of the case. Back in the OR, Meredith and Bailey are working well together, even with the underlying tension. But Bailey eventually confronts Meredith directly about her relationship with Derek. She tells her it'll make things harder, and Meredith responds that she's willing to take the heat. George, despite being nervous, ultimately reports the anesthesiologist. It doesn't go smoothly. Derek initially doesn't back him, but George stands his ground. Tragically, George's fears are validated when Derek's surgery begins to go sideways. The anesthesiologist falls asleep mid-procedure due to intoxication. Meanwhile, Izzy continues to be passive-aggressive toward Meredith until Meredith finally snaps. Bailey overhears and, surprisingly, laughs, reminding them that Meredith isn't the only one being held to a higher standard right now. Alex's patient starts crashing, and despite all efforts, he dies. The experience forces Alex to reckon with how careless and naive he was about the situation. After the failed surgery, Derek apologizes to George, admitting he should have listened and that George was right. He also owns up to his relationship with Meredith, saying his intentions are real, not just some fling. That night, Meredith and Izzy get into a heated fight at home. Izzy accuses Meredith of throwing away all the respect she's earned and claims everything comes easy for her. But when she sees that Meredith is actually in love, her tone softens. Finally, Christina receives life-changing news. She's pregnant. Izzy is obsessively trying to recreate her mom's cupcake recipe, but keeps failing. Despite her frustration, she stubbornly refuses to call her mother for help. Meanwhile, Meredith wants to take the next step with Derek and stay at his place for a change, since they've always been spending time at hers. George and Izzy both agree it's time she gets to know him better. Christina, dealing with her pregnancy alone, quietly visits an abortion clinic to schedule the procedure. She asks George to cover her shift without explaining why. Meredith tells Derek she wants to hit pause on the physical side of their relationship until she can actually get to know him better. Derek brushes it off with a casual, everything is gravy, which doesn't sit well with her. At the hospital, Izzy becomes fixated on a new patient who claims to be psychic and says he can see the future. Christina is skeptical and immediately tries to disprove him, but he guesses that she's pregnant, which rattles her. She passes the patient off to Izzy without explanation. George and Alex are paired up, and the tension is thick. Alex is dismissive as usual, and George struggles under the pressure. Burke notices and steps in, calmly teaching George how to do the procedure correctly. Alex then makes a snide comment that only worsens George's frustration. Meredith keeps trying to peel back Derek's layers, but he continues dodging her questions. She grows more impatient as the day goes on. The psychic wastes no time getting under Izzy's skin, correctly guessing what's wrong with her cupcake recipe and striking a nerve. Bailey later calls Izzy out for getting too emotionally involved with her patients, saying she always makes things too personal. Alex lets his ego get the better of him. When asked why women seem to like him, he leans into the arrogance, which backfires when he tells a patient about a procedure before Burke gives approval. Izzy continues to project her unresolved issues with her mother onto her psychic patient. It's clear that his presence is dredging up old wounds. Christina's patient, a pregnant cancer patient, chooses to keep the baby despite the risk it poses to her own life. Christina is visibly upset and vents her frustration on Burke when he tries to offer her support. George connects with a scrub nurse who helps him practice the procedure he previously fumbled. He finally gets it right, but he's not fast enough. Burke ends up picking Alex to assist in surgery instead. Still, the moment is a small personal win for George. After a day of tension, Meredith and Derek stop bickering and finally acknowledge that what they have is real. Meredith begins to let her guard down again. Izzy puts her biases aside and helps guide the psychic through surgery, finally finding a bit of peace with the situation. She opens up to George about her childhood, revealing that her mother was overly dependent on scam psychics, which shaped Izzy's distrust. Before the patient leaves, he gives Izzy one last piece of advice, the missing ingredient to fix her cupcake recipe. She smiles and finally makes the call to her mom. Meanwhile, Derek makes a gesture of vulnerability. He brings Meredith to his home, a trailer. It's modest and unexpected, but it's enough to make Meredith feel comfortable. It's the first real look she gets at the man behind the attending title, and it's a step forward for both of them. George begins experiencing a troubling medical issue involving his private parts, but he's too embarrassed to ask for help directly. Meanwhile, Meredith keeps dodging calls from her mother's nursing home. They want her to visit, but she ignores the messages and hides it from Derek. George is now dating Olivia, the scrub nurse. Trying to figure out what's wrong with him, he asks her for advice in a roundabout way, but gets nowhere. Desperate, he turns to Alex, who confirms the awkward truth. George has syphilis. When George tells Izzy, she mocks him for getting an STD and takes the opportunity to trash talk Olivia. Word quickly spreads through the hospital, and soon everyone knows about George's condition, much to his dismay. Alex becomes curious about the chain of transmission and starts speculating who infected whom. George eventually confronts Olivia, but is too awkward and apologetic, even though it's obvious she gave it to him. For reasons that baffle even his friends, George is more worried about hurting her feelings than his own health. Meanwhile, Chief Richard Weber seems off in surgery. He fumbles during a routine procedure and later storms out, frustrated. It's clear something is wrong. Burke treats an old friend with an ovarian issue, while Christina avoids telling him about her scheduled abortion. George, embarrassed but committed to treatment, gets a painful rectal shot, and everyone barges in during the process, humiliating him even further. At the same time, Meredith is still avoiding her mother, despite promises to herself to visit. She tells Derek she'll try, but continues to put it off. Due to the outbreak of syphilis among hospital staff, Patricia delivers an uncomfortable but necessary sex ed talk to the doctors. Burke reassures Christina that she's the only one he's been with, subtly checking in about her health status. Richard finally confides in Derek that he has a brain tumor and asks him to perform a secret surgery. Derek agrees. Meanwhile, Izzy and Christina perform a procedure without proper supervision. The patient dies unexpectedly, leaving them rattled and unsure if they were at fault. In a panic, Izzy convinces Christina to help her perform an unauthorized autopsy to avoid being labeled with the dreaded 007, code among interns for someone who kills patients. With Bailey distracted by Richard's surgery, they manage to proceed. Meredith accidentally lets it slip to Bailey, who is furious. But once the autopsy reveals valuable information, Bailey begrudgingly helps them finish it. Richard's surgery seems successful, but his recovery is slow. Afterward, he makes a pointed, inappropriate remark to Meredith, suggesting her mother would think she's making a mistake, clearly touching a nerve. Meredith, now crushed with guilt, learns she missed a visit on the one day her mother was lucid. It finally pushes her to open up to Derek. She confesses that her mother has Alzheimer's. Olivia comes clean to George and reveals that Alex gave her syphilis, meaning Alex unknowingly infected multiple people in the hospital. George, fed up, confronts Alex and starts a full-blown fight in the locker room, yelling, "You gave me syphilis," as onlookers try to break them up. Just when Meredith thinks her day couldn't get worse, she and Derek are leaving the hospital when a striking red-haired woman approaches. She turns to Meredith and says coldly, "You must be the woman who's screwing my husband." Now that the season's done, let's talk about the last few characters. Richard. Richard will be a very vital part of this show and the storylines going forward. However, this season, his involvement is pretty bare bones. He mostly just works as the caring boss figure. That said, there's a lot of potential with him. This season, we see his connection to Meredith's mother and learn that he's dealing with some health issues. My issue with Richard, though, is that even as early as season 1, there are signs that he's too old for this and is thinking about stepping down as chief. The problem with all of this is that he's still on the show 20 seasons later. It just shows how tired I am of this character. He's had one foot out the door since season 1, but never actually leaves. Alex. Alex is the bad boy of the cast, and he spends most of this first season being an asshole for no real reason. The show presents it like that's just how he is, and the rest of the interns begrudgingly tolerate him. There are signs that he'll eventually drop the act, especially when he gets served reality checks. But I personally dislike Alex because it feels like I'm meant to. He's written in a way that makes it hard to root for him, at least in season 1. Meredith. Meredith is the protagonist, so naturally she's the most developed and interesting character so far. She's a strong lead because we see her trying to find her place in the surgical field while also juggling a complicated romance and the emotional weight of her mother's dementia. Since Meredith and Ellis have a strained relationship, that adds an extra layer to her character. You can tell it causes her to keep her guard up and fear vulnerability, especially with Derek. That fear ends up being justified, since after everything they go through, Derek is still hiding the fact that that red-haired woman, who turns out to be his wife, is in the picture. Olivia, Patricia, and Ellis are the last recurring characters worth mentioning, but honestly, they don't add much to the show at this point. And with that, that's the end of season 1 of Grey's Anatomy. Thank you so much for watching.